Hello and welcome to another episode again. Very sad because last week the current guest right now came down with the vid, so couldn't really record anything off the top of my head. And the guests that I was gonna have as a replacement, our schedules didn't really match. And then I kind of wanted to post another episode, but couldn't find any time with school starting up again. But luckily, Thomas is here, and he came back with his sense of smell and taste still, which is very good. And I'm
Excellent.
very glad that he made a speedy recovery from it. But today we're going to be talking about a very interesting fandom. If you are familiar with it, it's the furries fandom. Thomas has some very very in depth research on it. And Thomas, can you give a brief intro of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. Thank the universe for not killing me of COVID. Um, as you said, my name is Thomas Brooks. I am the assistant professor of psychology at New Mexico Highlands University. I'm also the host of the Psychosocial Distancing podcast. And I do research. Well, part of my research, I do too much research, to be honest. But one of my areas is in the furry fandom with the Fur Science Research Group.
So, for the people who don't really know what furries are, and I'm still kind of new to furries myself, I've kind of just seen like pictures and like people say, "Oh, I hear a lot of people saying if my kid is ever a furry, I'm not gonna allow that." But I'm like, what is a furry really? So if you look it up, I feel like the general public has a very bad name for furries. All I see online when I search it up are people dressing up in like fur animal costumes, and I feel like people mix it up with that they are actually like LARPing
Hmm.
in the public as like fur animals. Can you like debunk some of the things that we see on online about furry?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we boil everything down and we're just left with like the bare bones definition of what a furry is, it is a fan of anthropomorphic art, which is both very broad and also kind of like confusing a little bit to people. So anthropomorphic is basically the idea of a merging of human and animal characteristics. And so I'm pretty sure everybody has seen anthropomorphic art outside of a furry context. And so if you've seen the movie Zootopia, you have these animals in this city. They look kind of human, they're bipedal, they live in a society. And that would be the anthropomorphization of animals for that particular art piece. Older examples, of course, are like the Robin Hood Disney movie. Really, Disney does anthropomorphic art the best, and that's usually the entryway for a lot of furries is through Disney movies. Um, so that's the bare bones of what furries are. Now, you mentioned LARPing, and there is a little bit of LARPing involved. Um, so this idea, so usually for furries, and some of them don't, but most of them do, is they have what they call a fursona, which is a colloquial persona, which is basically a anthropomorphic avatar that stands in for the furry in role playing situations or just as a central art piece. You can think of I usually think of personas as like characters in D&D or Dungeons and Dragons. And so you create your character, you give it a personality, a backstory, you give it an alignment. Is it neutral? Neutral? Is it, lawful good? And then you go into this fictional world through role play, and your character makes decisions on behalf of you. Um, and so that is what the fursona is. So there is a little bit of LARPing involved, but I will say that most of the time, furries actually don't dress up. Not because they don't want to, but because fursuits are incredibly expensive. And so the majority of the fandom
They
actually
seem
don't have
warm too.
fursuits. Do it now?
I was gonna say they seem really warm too.
Oh, you have no like so. one of the things that I do with this research group is we go to furry conventions to hand out surveys and talk with fandom members about research. And like the first day is great and fun and everything, but then by like day 2 and 3, when you're in an elevator with like 5, 6, 10 fursuiters who've been in the same suit for more than 24 hours, it's brutal.
How do they react when you are handing them surveys and saying that basically we're doing a survey and kind of like like researching your guys's like fandoms? Do some of them take that in the wrong way? Like they're kind of like they're taking it as if you're saying that they're kind of like I don't want to say freaks, but like
Right, that
very
like, "Hey, I'm a
yeah
psychologist, fill out this survey." Like, that gives
yeah
big
survey so I
clinical
can study your
vibes.
habits and yes
Yes.
yes.
I will say that that was a hill to cross in the early stages of Fur Science, and so Fur Science is a collaborative research project between American and Canadian social psychologists. I joined, I think, 10 years into the project because my advisor is one of the founding members of it. And so they had to cross that bridge early on in the fandom, but there's such a First Science has had such a presence at so many different furry conventions for so many years, more than 10 years at this point, that there is a mutual trust with the researchers. They understand the difference between like a clinical psychologist asking them questions and social psychologists asking them questions. So we're not terribly interested in pathology, but we also, I think, which is very crucial, and I think this is something that's really developed a research ethics for me, is this idea of engagement with the community that you're researching. So it's one thing to hand, a community a survey and say, "Hey, give me your data so I can move up in my career," right? And then I'll never talk to you again. Thank you for filling out the survey. Goodbye. Which is pretty shitty. Um, Alternatively, what we do is we make sure that we are physically present at these events. We make sure that we are visually seen contributing to the community through purchasing art, for example. We can get into that in just a minute. But I think what's most important is that we host panels at these conventions where usually it's my advisor, sometimes it's Courtney Plunt, who pretty much leads for science. But they will get up there and talk about the last year's survey results with the furries, take questions, teach them a little bit of statistics, and then there'll be a Q&A session of what do the furries want to see in the next year's research, right? So it's not just that we're like harvesting your data for, career advancement, but it's a mutual relationship between the fandom and the researchers where we get input from the fandom feels like they have a voice in the research, and they can also direct what research is being conducted on them as well. So we take seriously their own curiosity about themselves, which I think is really important.
I think yeah, I think that's pretty cool. Like you're helping them kind of find like kind of like the roots of furries.
Hmm.
It sounds like you're really immersed or have a very good relationship with the furry community that you do your research in. Have you ever like really like fully immersed yourself into their world? Like you put yourself in their shoes for like a day or two or even like a week and you kind of just go through and like see what I don't know if they have like specific because you referenced the Dungeons and Dragons
Hmm.
analogy. Do they have like scheduled meetings on a weekly basis or even on like a monthly basis where they just meet up and they talk about certain things like and if they do, what's really in those type of meetings?
Huh. Well, I'm not in the furry inner sanctum, if that's what you're asking. Um,
Oh no
I
no
will
no! I
say,
just mean like just immersing yourself for research purposes.
right. No, it's so I think attending the furry conventions is crazy immersion, right? So on one hand, I'm sitting behind a table and I'm passing out surveys and I'm answering questions and I'm giving people literature um, that we've written about them essentially. But that only lasts like half of the day, and then the rest of the day I get to explore the convention, right? And so at a typical convention, there is a dealer's room, which is usually the largest ballroom at a hotel. The one that I go to is Furry Fiesta. Typically, it's held at some of the bigger hotels in Dallas, Texas. And so the dealer's room is where all of the artists and merchants, for lack of a better word, set up their booths and sell their wares. And so you get to walk around and meet the artists, you get to commission work from them, you get to purchase things from them. And then there's an artist alley as well where indie artists set up booths and you can watch in real time as they, make their art and you can commission things from them. Um, and then they also have scheduled panels, everything from how to make a fursuit, drawing classes, painting classes, um,
Oh, wow.
role play classes, writing classes. I went to a writing seminar once about, how to set up do world building within novel writing. And so really the function of the convention is very much an art community, an art learning space, an art purchasing space. Now, in the evenings, they typically have what they call a rave. It's not really a rave, but it used to be a rave. Now they've kind of clamped down on it because families come to furry conventions quite a bit. So they try to keep it PG as possible. So that's usually where you have in fandom musicians and DJs playing their tracks. And then usually, and we'll see if they do it again this year. I intend on going this year. I haven't been in a couple years at this point um, because of COVID, obviously. But usually there is an entire floor of rooms that all share the same balcony, and that is the party floor. And so in the evenings, all of the 21 and older furries gather, and they have the DJs playing in all of the party rooms, and they have bars, and then they have the open patio where everyone socializes and dances with their rave gear and fursuits. And so I will say that I've had that level of immersion. I've definitely partied with the furries when I go off the clock from handing out surveys. And these conventions last like 5 days, right? So we show up the day before, and it's just a whirlwind from like Wednesday to Sunday of talking and visiting and hanging out with and getting to know the furry community. It's been very fun. It's been I've been to four. Have I been to four? Have I been to three? I think I've been to three. The last one was in 2020, right before COVID hit. I remember sitting on my hotel bed watching NHK, the Japanese public television, talking about COVID. And my advisor and I were sitting there going, "Is COVID coming? Is it going to come to the States?" And I was like, "I don't know." And then as soon as we get out of Furry Fiesta, COVID hits the States and we all lock down. So that was like the last normal thing I did before COVID was hang out with furries, if you want to call that normal.
Hey, that's not. I mean, like from what you're saying, it doesn't sound out of the ordinary. It sounds pretty normal
Yeah.
to
I
me.
mean, it's very
But
similar to, say, an anime convention or fans of like DC or Marvel doing what's it called, Comic Con. Like they're very similar spaces. This one just happens to
gotcha.
be full of fursuiters, and instead of like popular actors or voice actors doing panels, they have like creative writing panels and like drawing panels and sewing workshops.
Yeah, could you talk more about like this like the writing aspect of it? Like was there like a specific I don't even know how you would even structure that.
So basically, the way the panel worked was they had I can't remember his name, but he's a author. I think he self publishes, um, but he's very popular within the furry fandom. He writes furry stories, obviously, but like just because your characters are furries doesn't mean that you like neglect all mechanics of creative writing. That's not really a special genre where you bend things around. You just have anthropomorphic characters. Um, and
Mm.
so a lot of it's about the one that I attended was very much soft world building versus hard world building. And so soft world building would be something like, I don't know, a Lord of the Rings, for example. You don't really know the mechanics of the world of Lord of the Rings, right? We don't know exactly how magic works. It just
Mm.
works. We don't know what kind of gods and monsters exist on the periphery. We just know they're there. And so the characters and the writer are free to do whatever they want and justify it however they want to, right? Because we don't have the ability to peek behind the curtain and look at like the nitty gritty details of, oh well, if you do this kind of magic then it has to be like this, but then here are the rules and exceptions. It's very soft and fluid, um, which
Keep it
yeah,
simple.
keep it simple. And this is opposed to like hard world building where you have specific rules, there's a logic to the world. I know exactly the
Mm.
mechanics. The author spends a lot of time delving into like universal laws, and then the, interesting behaviors of the characters are navigating those rules and finding loopholes in order to beat the bad guy and save the day, right? And so it's a little bit more fluid versus mechanistic. But that's what the panel was over. And so the furries who were interested in becoming writers or taking their personas on adventures through writing, through that medium, were there taking notes and learning how to craft better stories about their personas, which I thought was really cool.
Is there like a main hub where people share their stories, or is it just like freelancing and you kind of just post it as like a blog, as a blog post?
I believe the website is called Fur Affinity, and that's where stories, digital art, traditional art, comics, fursuit updates. That's typically where all of that happens. Is It's called Fur Affinity, I believe, and that's the tends to be the central hub for furry art of all genres.
When it comes to their drawing, is there a specific style that they kind of stick with? Like, if you're if you're going to aim for a drawing, you want to stick to like this is the core concept of what you kind of have to have in order for it to be like a furry drawing, and then from outside of there, you're free to like add anything else you want.
Um, I think the only, and this is, I'm a non-expert when it comes to the furry drawing, right? So I spend most of
Oh
my
yeah,
time
yeah.
doing
I'm
the
just
psych research. But I will say I have noticed a
yeah.
difference between what they call the more anthropomorphic art, where it looks more like a Disney character, um,
Okay.
versus what they call feral, which is more like art depicting animals in their natural habitats, right? So there is kind of a spectrum
Oh.
of like realistic animal to um, anthropomorphism, I will say. But if you go to say the furry convention, the art that's displayed just it ranges, right? It could be a lot of anthropomorphic art. I bought a set of carved runes, rune stones from a furry convention once. Has nothing to do with being a furry. They were just there and they were really pretty. And so tends to be a lot of what we think of as like traditional artists, sculptors, non-furry artists who do furry fiesta because it's a huge art community with people who are interested in buying and consuming art.
Dang, I feel like those people who can draw like the furries and like the animals right now must be flourishing because the NFTs that are kind of taking off. Like a lot of the popular NFTs now are kind of like animal based.
Right, they all
So
look like it looks like furry art. They're all anthropomorphic animals.
yeah.
Oh man, don't tell the
So I was like,
NFT
wow,
bros
people.
that. What does the F in NFT stand
Oh,
for? Furry.
oh my god, that'd be funny. But like, it's I mean, like, from the way that you're talking about it now, it just seems like furry people, this is like something that they kind of do on the side, and it's not like their entire personality on how I mean, like how the internet or media outlets really portray them as.
Yeah, I would say that they are, and this is from the research from my lab, we do research with all sorts of fandoms, right? So Star Wars, fantasy football, bronies, furries, um, UFO fans. And furries are not unique when it comes to their engagement with the fandom. They're pretty run of the mill, right? So, one of the things we find is that furries are furries because they want a place to belong. They like the aesthetics. Um, it increases their self esteem to belong to a group, just like everybody, whether it's your church or your school or your club or your family. Like being a part of a group feels good. That's why furries are there. There's a little bit of escapism, which we see across all fandoms, right? And it's entertaining. And overall, we see an increase in life satisfaction the longer they're in the fandom. And that's what we see with many different fandoms. And I would say that there's kind of a gradient, right? So, on one hand, you have people who are into Star Wars. It's not their whole life, but they get excited when a new Star Wars movie or miniseries comes out on Disney Plus. And then you have people who spend exorbitant amounts of money on like stormtrooper gear, so that way they can go out and LARP with their stormtrooper brethren in the wild, right? And so the furries are the same way. Like some of them are just like, yeah, no, I like the art and I have a persona and I show up to a convention every now and then. And then on the other hand, you have people that like live the role play life 100% of the time. And this is a difference theoretically we call fanship versus fandom. And so fanship is the
Hmm.
level of interest in the thing that the fandom is centered around, right? So I would say that me personally, I have high fanship in Star Wars movies. I love watching Star Wars movies. Star Wars movies are the jam. Um, but alternatively, there's fandom, which is my identification with other fans. And my fandom is super low. I will probably never dress up as a stormtrooper and go marching through the woods. I probably will not go to a Star Wars themed event. But I am very interested in the movies themselves. I just don't really identify or participate with the group. And so with furries, it's the same way. Like some of them are super into the art, they do it as a side thing, they're not really connected with the community. Alternatively, there are furries who are very invested in the community and do show up at the conventions and do show up at like weekly meetups with other furries. So it kind of depends on the person and kind of where their needs need to be met, right? So if you have a high need
Mhm.
to belong, if you're pretty disembedded from your community, your society, your family, then a fandom is a great place to find that community and meet those psychological needs. If you've got things going on, if you're super busy, if you're super, well connected within your family group, in your community and your friend groups, and they're not furries, you're probably not going to strongly identify with being a furry. It's not going to be a big slice of your life.
Yeah, this like learning more about it kind of makes me kind of mad of how, like how people kind of interpret how they are, because like from the sounds of what you're telling me right now, it just seems like they're very normal people. But I feel like a lot of things are getting really blown out of proportion when it comes to people telling other people what they are, or just like media outlets just kind of like condemning them.
I will say there has been some more positive media coverage of furries. One instance, I believe, with the Syrian refugees that were coming to America a couple years ago. They were put up in a hotel that was also hosting a furry convention. And so there's a lot of really cute, like, welcome to America photos of like these Syrian refugees with the furries. And that was very heartwarming. And then they were also featured right before the pandemic, actually at Texas Furry Fiesta, where I was at. I didn't make it into the background shots of anything though. But Full Frontal with Samantha Bee did a segment on the furry fandom. Um, and she had her comedic reporters out there interviewing furries about politics and stuff like that and portrayed them in a very positive light. So I don't think it's you're right. There's a lot of stigma directed at the community, but also it's a little bit more ambivalent than it has been in the past. Um, and part of the reason for that is it's a little weird, right? Like developing a persona, fursuiting, like that's outside of the norm. But also,
Hmm.
the furry community is one of the more open fandoms. So they don't really have a limit to who can join. It's kind of like free speech on steroids, and so they actually kind of have a little bit of a Nazi problem. Um,
Oh.
that it's a problem in that they exist, not as in like the furries are turning into Nazis. But there are furries that have like Nazi regalia that do their LARPing that way. Um, and so that's a little bit of a problem. But I think a lot of the stigma directed at the furries is more to do with the fact that a lot of people who are already bullied online are becoming furries anyway, because that's a community that will accept them. And so the furries
Hmm.
have, even though the majority of them are male, there's a huge transgender and gender diversity population within the furry fandom. Like when you go to a convention,
And
you see every single shade of every single color of the rainbow of gender diversity at a furry fandom, at a furry convention. Um, and they also have the highest autistic population of any fandom we found so far, too. And so you get some gender diversity, you get some sexual orientation diversity, you get some neurodivergent diversity, and it's pretty much a bunch of people who were already bullied that have joined together into a fandom that is now just getting collectively bullied, right?
interesting. And yeah, that was gonna lead me to a question that I saw when I was looking up furries and like what furries are. A lot of the questions on the websites asked are all are a majority of furries in the LGBTQIA community? And I want to ask, like, why is that such a commonly asked question uh for a lot of people?
I don't think they're the major. I think bisexuality is the majority. So yes, to answer your question, I think there's two factors that play here, right? So on one hand, it is a highly stigmatized community that will accept anyone. So if you're already bullied, if you're already stigmatized by society, if you already feel like people don't accept you, there's a fandom here that will accept you. They don't really care who you are. And I think that's very attractive, right? That's like, if you're having family issues around your sexuality or gender identity, and so your only place for camaraderie or support is online, and then you find the furries, and the furries are like, hey, we love you, we don't care who you are or how you identify, then that's a really nice place to belong. And so I think it attracts members of the LGBTQIA plus. Where are we at in the alphabet soup right now? I say that as a gay man, but I've run out. I
I,
can't remember. It changes every year. um,
I
I think
think
I
you
hit
hit
them
it
all. I think there's also
on
a
the nail.
two S,
Yeah.
two spirit. I think we're including them now too in the letters. So if you're already a part of a stigmatized group, it's pretty easy to get accepted and find belonging and friendship and camaraderie, right? On the other hand, too, because it's a role playing community with these personas, um, there is possibility that you can explore alternative selves with your persona. So the three biggest motivators for the persona are, it's either a true representation of the self, and so your persona can be who you are deep inside, and you may have to put on a mask in your family or school or work, but your persona's personality and characteristics are more true to who you are than how you behave in the real world. The persona could also be an idealized self, so who you want to be. So you may load up your persona with personality qualities and skills and attributes of like who you want to be, who your idealized self is. And so you create this persona to be like the goalpost of like, hey, this is where I'm going to personally grow until I can become one with these characteristics of my persona. Or the persona can be kind of like a doppelganger for alternative ways of being. And so the persona can be like, maybe you've grown up, you're like, I'm straight, society expects me to be straight. I figured I'd marry a woman, have kids, do the whole picket fence, 2.5 kids and a dog thing. But the persona can be, you know, anything. And so you can explore, safely explore alternative lives or alternative ways of being or alternative futures with your persona that then you can go before you actually like commit to. And so you can test the waters out ahead of time, um, and see, is this who I want to be? Um, and then if it is, you can start aligning yourself with where your persona is. So it's kind of a interesting relationship between the furry and the persona beyond just like, oh, this is my role playing character. It also has like personal growth implications as well.
All right, we had a slight technical difficulty, but we are back.
We're back.
But yeah, luckily it did cut off like right when I was about to say something, so you don't have to repeat what you previously said. So that is a very good thing. And I think as a closing topic, uh, it's a very awkward question to ask, but is furry fandom really all sexual?
Well, if you watch Law and Order and read like popular culture about furries, then you would be that's a perfectly reasonable question, right? The I think the popular imagination of furries is that they're getting up to stuff in those fursuits, right? Um, just for anyone who was curious, when two furries engage in sexual intercourse with their fursuits on, it is called yiffing. Um, and there is sex stuff in the fandom. I would say that with the furries, there it might go further outside of the norm just because there are people in the fandom who are further outside of the norm. Um, but I think with fandom in general, you see a lot of sex stuff anyway. So, like, if you look at, say, the Pokemon fandom, for example, you can definitely find Pokemon hentai. Star Wars, don't get me started with Princess Leia in her slave suit. So there are sexual aspects to fandoms, regardless of the fandom that we're looking at. I think the furries are just particularly salacious. I do have some stats or
what
some
do you
research.
what do
Oh,
you
go
mean
ahead.
by what do you mean by salacious?
The idea of anthropomorphic characters having sex or being sexualized borders on the popular imagination of things like zoophilia or bestiality, which is a major taboo, right? Like anything that even creeps close to it, people panic.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that the furries are zoophilic by any means. That's not generally what we see. Usually, so some of the older research that the Fur Science Group has done, um, is there tends to be a lower influence of pornography about furries in the fandom, even to the extent of like the furries think there's more porn in the fandom than there actually is. And so the popular culture, as well as members of the fandom, all tend to overestimate the level of like sexual motivation within the fandom. And there's a lot of work within the fandom right now of trying to curb those stereotypes. And so people get very defensive when it comes to sex and the furries within the fandom. They're like, it's not about sex, it's about art. And I would agree with that, right? So I talked about going to the convention. The only sexualized material that I saw is they have like one tiny room that they it's like a makeshift room of like curtains, and there's a bouncer in front of it, and it's like 18 years and over, and it's a erotic art section within the art gallery at the
Oh.
convention. And so you have to show your ID to get in, and there's maybe like 10 to 20 pieces of art in there that's erotic in some way. So it is there, but it's relegated off to the side and highly policed within the fandom.
Okay.
Generally, it's very ambivalent when it comes to the erotic art. Um, some of the fandom members are very pro erotic furry art. Some of them appreciate it for erotic art, and some of them are completely against it. I will say we have a research article that's currently under revision and review. So this is where we're in conversation with the journal editor and the peer reviewers who have suggested changes to minor things like how we report stats and like what research did we include in our introduction. But generally, the study found that overall sexual motivation in the furry fandom is relatively low. And if we account for social factors like the belonging, aesthetics, self esteem, escapism, that we see negligible. Is that how you pronounce that?
Negligible.
Severely reduced sexual motivation in the furries. So this idea that like furries move into the furry fandom through pornography or through like deviant sexualities um, happens for some, but as soon as we start accounting for things like needing to belong to a group of people, having friends, appreciating the aesthetics, that creativity, self growth, that those motivations like shrink substantially. And ironically, it's mostly the erotic art that is driving sexual interest and not fursuiting. So, like, even the stereotype placed on the furries about yiffing, A, can't be true because there's not enough of them who have fursuits, and B, of the ones who are sexually interested in like parts of the fandom, we found that on average they scored a 1.85 out of 7 with regards to sexual interest in fursuiting. So I think that's the biggest misconception is it's not even the fursuits.
I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense. Because I feel like with the creative mind, like if you have seen sexualized photos of anime characters or even like anything fandom related, the creative mind can add whatever features it really wants on a particular drawing. So, you see it a lot in animes like Naruto or something. You see the normal characters, but the creator behind it can add features, whether that be bigger breasts or anything in that area. When in regards to like a fursuit's only limited to what is really produced out there. Like no one's gonna. I feel like you don't really see a lot of photos of sexualized furry suits, but you will see a lot of more drawings
Uh,
of it.
yeah, there's definitely more drawings than
Yeah,
fursuits, but you spend time in a fandom long enough, and really any fandom, right? Like anime
yeah.
fans. Don't get me started on the bronies. Um,
Oh god.
but the furries as well. Like you spend enough time, you go deep enough, you find the stuff. Like it's
Hmm.
always there. It doesn't matter what fandom road you take, you will always find the core of the internet, which is weird sex
Disgusting.
stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like what rule 4 of the internet. Anything that you think of can be sexualized.
Yep, Rule
So
34.
rule 34, yeah, rule 34 of the internet. Anything that you can think of, imagine, it can be sexualized easily. And trust me, if you type in anything space rule 34, the internet will never prove you wrong. Well, will never be
Yes.
wrong. And
And
it's
you will be
astonishing.
punished for using those search terms.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. But
So
Thomas,
it's the furry sex stuff's there. It's not unique or special or crazy. Like as much as, if we compare it to other fandoms, it's not that.
it's like
Now
on
for
par.
non-internet people, it might seem that way. And but also the whole internet is a scary place anyway. So like keep some perspective.
Indeed, indeed. So yeah, if you ever, if you, well, whenever you see the word furry, don't give it that little, don't give it like a bad name. Like, I hope that after this podcast, you kind of learned a lot about furries and you kind of realize that they're not as weird as you may think, as like how people portray them as. So I'm very glad that we talked about this and that I was able to have you come on and provide some research and some personal experience of like what you've seen and how it doesn't really connect with the misconceptions about them. So I thank you for that.
Of
Thomas,
course.
where can my listeners find you?
Yes, so I have a couple things. So First off, you can follow me on Twitter. I think that's the majority of where my activity is. It's going to be at tbrooks underscore sex sci. Um, and I mostly just tweet about my podcast, Psychosocial Distancing, which is a weekly podcast where my co host Daniel Chadbourne and I talk about psychology research. We just wrapped a mini series on conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking, where we interviewed some of the top researchers in the field, from political science to psychology to history to library science, about what are conspiracy theories, who are conspiracy theorists, and should we panic about them like everybody else seems to be. This semester, we're talking about qualitative research, and talking with some people who employ that kind of methodology and the cool ways that they use it. Um, if you want to keep up with the furry research in the field, you can go to furscience.com. Particularly if you are a parent or a clinician listening to this, we do have some FAQs on furries and whether or not you should panic or not. Generally, don't panic. But it'll give you the rundown on what's happening generally with the research, and then we also upload as much of the open access research as we possibly can.
Love that.
And then lastly, we do have a book that came out about fan interest overall. So, not just furries, but all sorts of fans, from Star Wars to fantasy football to Jane Austen. And it's called the Cape, a multidimensional model of fan interest. It is also, we published it through, we self published this one. So that way we could bring the price down because academic publishing is disgusting and disrespectful. Um, so if you want a physical copy of the book, you can get it on Amazon for like $8. But also, I will link. Well, I'll ask Brian to link the PDF of the book in the show notes, if that's all right with you, Brian.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I was gonna actually say like whatever links you want me to share, just send them over, and I will link them in the description of this podcast, and along with the More You Know website and on the More You Know Facebook page, and I will be sure to link it to all of those when this episode releases.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for coming on. It was a real fun time talking to you. I learned a lot, and and we'll probably have you back on the podcast on another episode to talk more.
Cool. I look forward to it.